Welcome, chosen ones. The loudest sound in history has never been an explosion. It's always been silence. Silence isn't neutral. It isn't harmless, and it definitely isn't accidental. In fact, psychologists say that bystander silence can be more traumatic than the abuse itself, because it confirms the victim's invisibility. And chosen ones, you lived that truth. They knew what was done to you. They saw it. They whispered about it. Some even joked about it at dinner tables. But when the moment came to stand, to speak, to defend, you became the one figure everyone suddenly pretended not to recognize. What's wild is people will binge-watch superhero movies where a stranger saves the world. But when it came to you, the real-life hero in their midst, they couldn't even stand up in a living room. Imagine that. The same mouths that could debate football stats for 3 hours couldn't spare 3 seconds to say that's wrong. This isn't just about cowardice. It's about complicity. Because their silence wasn't a pause, it was a choice. And that choice told you exactly where you stood in their hierarchy of value. But here's the twist. While they thought their silence buried you, it actually exposed them. Exposed their fear, their hypocrisy, and their dependence on your suffering to keep their world comfortable. So today we're going to pull the mask off that silence. We're going to dissect what it really meant when no one stood up, and why their silence might just be the loudest confession they ever made. Number 1, their silence wasn't ignorance, it was compliance. Their silence wasn't ignorance, it was compliance. They didn't miss what was happening to you. They saw it with their own eyes. They heard it with their own ears. And they felt the tension every time they entered the room. They knew. The problem is, people love to hide behind the excuse of, I didn't know what to do, when in reality they knew exactly what to do. They just didn't want to do it. Because doing something would mean becoming accountable. It would mean risking being rejected by the very people inflicting the harm. And it would mean sacrificing their comfort to protect your humanity. When they stayed silent, it wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. They decided that your suffering was less important than their approval. They decided that protecting their social standing was worth more than protecting your dignity. They decided that keeping peace with the abuser was safer than standing in truth with you. That's not neutrality. That's choosing a side, and it's the side that benefits from your pain. The most brutal part about this is that many of them will swear even now that they weren't involved. They'll claim they didn't participate, they didn't harm, they didn't touch anything. But silence itself is participation. Silence provides cover. Silence creates the perfect environment for abuse to grow without resistance. Silence says, I see what's happening, but I'd rather not lose my seat at the table. That's not innocence. That's complicity. And you have to be real with yourself. Their silence didn't just protect the abuser. It betrayed you. Because deep down you weren't asking for miracles. You weren't asking them to fight your whole war. Sometimes all it would have taken was a word, a hand, a refusal to go along with the lies. But they made their choice. And in doing so, they exposed who they really were. Now here's where the truth cuts even deeper. Their silence wasn't just about protecting themselves. It was also about testing you. They wanted to see if you would still stand when no one stood for you. They wanted to see if you would fold under the weight of abandonment. And the irony is their silence only proved what you already knew, that you were stronger than all of them combined. So when you think about their silence, don't treat it like an oversight. It wasn't. It was their signature on the contract of betrayal, and that signature is permanent. Number 2, they feared losing access to their own comfort. They feared losing access to their own comfort. That's the real reason they never stood up. It wasn't because they didn't care, and it wasn't because they didn't know. It was because standing up for you would have cost them something they weren't willing to give up. Comfort can be intoxicating. People will do anything to protect the little safety nets they've built for themselves. Whether that's approval from a family member, favor from a boss, or acceptance in a community. And when the time came to choose between their comfort and your well-being, they chose their comfort every single time. Think about it. Many of them lived off the crumbs of peace that were only possible because you were the one absorbing the chaos. You became the buffer, the shield, the one who carried the weight. As long as you were being targeted, they didn't have to be. That's why they stayed quiet. To defend you would mean removing that shield and risking becoming the new target themselves. Their silence wasn't just fear, it was strategy. Protecting their own skin mattered more than protecting your soul. The harsh truth is, people will often weigh situations like a transaction. They measure the cost of speaking against the cost of silence. And too often, silence feels cheaper. They tell themselves, if I stay quiet, I don't lose my job, my seat at the table, my circle, my privileges. But what they never admit is that by protecting those comforts, they were actively sacrificing you. It wasn't a neutral decision. It was a trade. And in that trade, you were treated as disposable. This is why betrayal cuts so deeply. It's not always about hatred. Sometimes it's about calculation. They calculated what it would cost them to stand with you, and they decided you weren't worth the price. That realization changes everything, because it forces you to stop asking why they didn't help. The answer is simple. They loved what they had too much to risk losing it for you, and here's where their comfort betrays them. The very thing they protected has become the evidence of their disloyalty. They thought silence would let them keep their standing, but in truth it stripped them of honor. They saved their comfort, but they lost their credibility. And one day when that comfort crumbles, they'll have nothing left to stand on because they already showed who they were when it mattered most. Number 3, the crowd wasn't helpless, they were calculating. The crowd wasn't helpless, they were calculating. That's the part most people don't want to admit. They weren't frozen in fear, paralyzed, or clueless about what to do. They were doing math. In their minds, they were measuring the risks and rewards, weighing the cost of action against the convenience of silence. And when they added it all up, they decided that protecting themselves was more profitable than protecting you. Their inaction wasn't weakness. It was a cold decision rooted in self-interest. People like to romanticize the bystander effect, as if crowds are just too shocked to move. But the truth is far uglier. They knew exactly what was going on. They could have spoken, intervened, questioned, or refused to participate in the smear campaigns against you. Instead, they calculated what they stood to lose. Status, safety, approval, maybe even access to the very people causing you harm. And in their arithmetic, your dignity didn't weigh enough to tip the scale. That's why it stings so much when you look back. You realize it wasn't that they couldn't help, it's that they wouldn't. They didn't freeze, they strategized. Some of them even positioned themselves to benefit from your downfall. They figured, if I stay quiet, at least I won't be next. Others saw opportunities to climb higher while you were being pushed down. Silence for them wasn't an accident. It was a ladder. This is what makes betrayal by a crowd so treacherous. It wasn't just one person choosing self-preservation. It was an entire network making the same calculation. And the irony is they all thought they were being clever by keeping their hands clean. But their silence became evidence of the deal they made. They aligned themselves with injustice, and in doing so they revealed their character far more than if they had openly joined in the harm. The truth is, calculations like that always backfire because the very person they abandoned, the one they thought had no power left, was the one carrying the kind of strength, resilience, and clarity none of them could ever buy with their silence. They thought their math was smart, but they miscalculated the outcome. In trying to protect themselves, they marked themselves as complicit. And history never forgets who stood by doing nothing when something could have been done. Number 4, the betrayal cut deeper because they had proof. They had proof, and that's what made the betrayal so savage. They didn't stand on ignorance or shaky memory. They had conversations saved, messages archived, videos that caught things on camera, and witnesses who quietly confirmed what happened. Those records were not neutral objects. They were potential lifelines. Instead of handing them over, they folded them into a fortress for their own safety. The proof that could have toppled the lie was repurposed as an alibi, a bargaining chip, or a quiet excuse to keep the status quo intact. When someone holds evidence and chooses silence, that silence carries intention. Here it says, I saw, I know, and I refuse to be inconvenienced. People will tell themselves stories to live with that choice. We'll handle it later. It's complicated. Someone else will fix it. But the reality is more direct. They weighed the cost of revealing the truth and decided their comfort, relationships, or position mattered more than your justice. That decision takes something human and converts it into a tactical move. It protected them. Worse, many used the evidence to control the narrative. They cherry-picked what to share, released fragments to shift blame, or sat on the rest until it suited them to use it as leverage. That's how proof becomes a weapon. Not by exposing the truth, but by allowing those who possess it to manipulate who is believed and when. The people who could have validated your story instead became gatekeepers, and the power imbalance deepened. Your credibility was not just undermined by the abuser. It was undermined by every ones who could have ended the harm. This kind of betrayal rewires trust. You learn that documents, recordings, and witnesses are only as safe as the hands that hold them. It creates a chilling calculus. Why risk your reputation on people who have already chosen self-preservation over justice? And yet in their attempt to shield themselves, they stamp their names on the act of betrayal. Silence with evidence is not innocence. It's willful participation dressed as prudence. In time, the layers of that protection can crumble, but the stain remains. The proof that was hoarded to save faces becomes the record of complicity. Their choice to bury or twist what they knew doesn't erase the truth. It only postpones the reckoning. When it comes, the very things they used as shields will testify against them, showing the world exactly what they refused to do when it mattered most. Number 5, they waited for you to break, not for you to heal. They waited for you to break, not for you to heal. That's the hardest truth to swallow because it reveals the hidden motives behind their silence. They weren't quietly rooting for your recovery in the background. They weren't hoping you would rise stronger and prove the cruelty wrong. Deep down, they wanted collapse. They wanted evidence that all the whispers, the slander, and the smirks were justified. Your pain wasn't just tolerated. It was anticipated almost like a show they bought tickets for. Silence became their front row seat. Every struggle you endured, every stumble you made was another moment they logged in their mental tally sheet, waiting for the big collapse. For them, your breaking would mean validation, that they were smarter, safer, more normal than you. It would mean the abuse you went through could be explained away as something you brought upon yourself. Healing, on the other hand, would strip them of that false sense of superiority. It would force them to admit that what happened to you was wrong, unjust and undeserved, and that's something they were never prepared to confront. This is why your survival feels so disruptive to them. They had already written the script of your downfall. They counted on your silence becoming permanent, on your spirit being too crushed to rise again. They rehearsed how they'd talk about you after the collapse, how they'd shake their heads with pity while secretly feeding off the drama. They didn't just expect you to break. They needed it to justify their own betrayal. But you didn't give them the ending they waited for. You refused to crumble, and in doing so, you forced them to sit with the uncomfortable truth. You endured what should have destroyed you, and that endurance exposed them, not as innocent bystanders, but as spectators who were disappointed when strength showed up where weakness was predicted. Their silence wasn't passive. It was laced with expectation. Every day you didn't break was a day they had to confront the fact that they were wrong about you. And that's the true punishment for their betrayal. They get to live with the reality that your healing didn't need them. Your resilience outlasted their apathy, and your survival made their silence look smaller than ever. Number 6, your suffering became their entertainment. Your suffering became their entertainment. They didn't stop it because your pain fed a show they watched in private. An endless loop of gossip, judgment, and whispered punchlines. When people turn someone's misery into contempt, they stop seeing a human and start seeing material. A plot twist to gossip about, a point to score in conversation, a cautionary tale to ghost through at parties. That transformation is corrosive. It strips away sympathy and replaces it with spectacle. And once that switch flips, outrage dies because laughter and outrage cannot comfortably occupy the same room. The mechanics are simple but vicious. Somebody starts a rumor or reveals a wound, and others lean in because it supplies something scarce, dramatic meaning. Your pain becomes astray that confirms their worldview. They laugh to shorten the distance between themselves and the horror of what they watched happen. They joke to avoid the shame of having witnessed and done nothing. Humor becomes a shield for cruelty. Inside private chats and after-work drinks, your trauma turns into the anecdote everyone repeats, embellished like a campfire story until the truth is barely recognizable. Consuming someone else's suffering also creates group cohesion. Shared contempt is glue. When people trade the same cruel story, they tighten alliances, assign ranks, and create insiders and outsiders. Your existence as the punchline cements their belonging. That dynamic is why intervention looks so risky to them. Because stopping the spectacle would mean losing a social currency they relied on to feel safe and superior. There's also a market logic at play. Scandal sells. Stories of downfall attract attention, sympathy, and sometimes profit. People learn to monetize outrage and humiliation, whether through social clout or petty status gains. When your pain becomes content, it isn't private pain anymore. It's public property. The more public it gets, the less likely anyone will treat it seriously. The outcome is predictable and brutal. The harmed person is isolated and dehumanized. While the observers get a cheap thrill and a dent in their conscience, they quickly polish away. That cheap thrill corrodes moral muscle. Repeatedly choosing amusement over action trains people to prefer spectacle over justice, entertainment over empathy. Your recovery, however, robs them of their show. When you refuse to be the ongoing joke, their stories lose their currency. That loss exposes their smallness. The only way they could stay connected was by watching you crumble. Their entertainment was a confession. It proved what they valued most. Comfort, gossip, a story that made them feel better about themselves, and it proved what they were willing to sacrifice to keep it. Number 7. They assumed no one would believe you anyway. They assumed no one would believe you anyway. And that assumption shaped every choice they made. From the start, they stacked the deck against your voice by rehearsing explanations that made you sound unstable, emotional, or unreliable. Those stories weren't accidental. People edited reality to make your testimony smaller and more chaotic, because a narrative of doubt protects everyone who benefits from your silence. By convincing themselves and others that your words would be dismissed, they created a self-fulfilling prophecy that silenced you before you even spoke. This wasn't naive pessimism. It was tactical. They understood how credibility works in real life. A single label, hysterical, volatile, dramatic, can erase years of clear evidence. So instead of using the proof they had to back you up, they whispered ways to discredit you later. They preserved reputations by preemptively discrediting the one person who could expose the truth. In their calculations, your voice was the threat, not the injustice. Removing your credibility felt safer than facing the crime. The result is brutal and practical. When you tried to tell the truth, the room was already prepared to turn on you. People remembered every past mistake you'd made and repeated it like ammunition. They emphasized inconsistencies, amplified your emotional responses, and reduced your testimony to anger or bitterness. All of that created noise around the facts. And in noisy rooms, facts often disappear. The silence that followed wasn't merely indecision. It was the comfortable outcome of a campaign to make disbelief the default. What makes this worse is how widely it spreads. Once a few influential voices sow doubt, others follow, because it's easier to fit into the chorus than to risk being the odd one out. That chorus frames your honesty as an overreaction, and the more it repeats, the more believable the lie becomes. Doubt is contagious, and they used it like armor. Their silence was an investment in that armor, because defending you would have meant dismantling the structure they'd helped build. In the end, their decision to assume you wouldn't be believed reveals their priorities. They valued the comfort of consensus over the messy work of truth. They preferred a simple, believable lie to a complicated, inconvenient truth. And that choice speaks louder than any apology ever could. Your voice was treated as a liability, not evidence. And in cruel irony, the system designed to protect the innocent became the mechanism they used to guarantee your isolation. Number 8. They didn't stand up because you were the mirror. They didn't stand up because you were the mirror. When your suffering was visible, it forced everyone around you to see parts of themselves they were trying hard to hide. Their small illness, their compromises, the times they chose ease over integrity. Defending you would have required them to admit those things, and admitting that is painful in a way most people aren't willing to accept. So instead, they looked away because a clear reflection demands change, and change costs something they weren't prepared to lose. The mirror you held up wasn't flattering. It revealed how gossip was easier than accountability, how loyalty could be traded for convenience. If they had stepped in even once, it would have started a chain reaction of accountability. Questions asked, alliances tested, reputations examined. That kind of upheaval threatens the neat stories people tell about themselves, that they are fair, kind, and moral. Confronting the truth would force them to rewrite those stories, and most people prefer a comforting lie to a disruptive truth. Defending you would also have exposed their role in the problem, even if that role was passive. Once you became the issue they couldn't ignore, it would ripple outward and touch everything they had built on the same shaky ground. Careers, friendships, influence, things that felt secure could have come under scrutiny. So they made a choice. Keep the reflection hidden by refusing to look at it. Silence served as a smoke-hawking screen that preserved their image and delayed the uncomfortable work of self-examination. There's another ugly piece. Mirrors can be dangerous to the mirror holder. If someone else sees what you show, they may demand accountability. and that demand could threaten the social order the silent ones depended on. So standing with you risked making them vulnerable to the same judgment. They valued that immunity more than your well-being. In the end, their refusal to act wasn't ignorance or forgetfulness. It was a protective maneuver for their identity. By avoiding the mirror, they preserved a version of themselves that could keep sleeping at night. That choice reveals a lot. They preferred an undisturbed conscience to the hard work of being decent when it mattered. Your reflection shined a light they feared, and rather than face it, they chose the darkness of silence. The cost of that choice sits on their shoulders forever, not yours. ID number 9. Some of them benefited from your pain. Some of them benefited from your pain. This is the ugly truth that people hide behind polite silence. Your hardship became a currency they could spend. While you were losing ground, others were quietly collecting influence, sympathy, money, or social capital. They learned to turn your crisis into advantage, and that made it convenient to do nothing. There are simple ways this happens. Someone uses your downfall to elevate their own reputation as the calm, reasonable one, while secretly taking credit for stability they never helped create. Another person leverages your vulnerability to consolidate power, nudging themselves into roles of authority because they were not like the others. Employers, relatives, or community figures sometimes profit financially by redirecting resources that should have supported you toward projects that boost their status. Even gossipers get payoffs. When your pain becomes a story, storytellers gain attention, followers, and leverage. Exploitation rarely arrives as a dramatic confession. It's methodical and quiet. People arrange facts, emphasize your mistakes, and amplify your failures so they can position themselves as insiders who saw it coming. That positioning translates into invitations, promotions, and alliances. Over time, those small advantages compound. The same people who offered a sympathetic nod at the right moment also pocketed benefits that would not exist if you had been treated fairly. Their gain depended on your loss. Emotional exploitation is just as real. Some draw energy from being the comforter while letting the harm continue. They build a brand of compassion that looks good in public but never costs them anything private. That performative empathy wins them trust and affection without the burden of action. It's a trade. A few consoling words in the open buys them credibility while the trouble stays yours to bear. Knowing this shifts how you see betrayal. It isn't only moral failure, it is calculation. When people profit from your pain, silence becomes an investment strategy. They choose inaction because action would reduce their advantage. That choice reveals priorities in stark terms. Your recovery undermines their business model. When you reclaim dignity, their gains evaporate. That's why some will cling to the narrative that kept them comfortable. Even when truth unravels it, their profit was built on your suffering and their peace was bought with your price. The ledger will be remembered. The people who treated your pain like product will one day stand before a world that sees the trade for what it was. Their advantage will look small. Your survival will look like the currency they could not buy. Number 10, they were afraid of the spotlight shifting. They were afraid of the spotlight shifting. That's why they stayed quiet. It wasn't that they couldn't see what was being done to you. It's that they knew if they dared to defend you, the same microscope would turn on them. The silence had nothing to do with protecting you or weighing truth carefully. It was survival mode. They calculated that if they kept their heads down, your torment would keep the wolves fed, and the wolves would never look their way. This is how fear mutates into complicity. People convince themselves they're being wise by staying out of the conflict. But underneath that logic is pure self-preservation. They knew that standing with you would mean inheriting some of your suffering. Whispers behind their back, their credibility questioned, maybe even losing the social security that came with blending in. So they hid behind you. Your struggle became their shield. As long as you were the focus, they were safe. That's the twisted part. They needed you to keep hurting, because your pain distracted the spotlight. They didn't just want silence for peace. They wanted silence for protection. Your wounds bought them cover. Every attack you endured gave them more time to remain unnoticed, more chances to maintain their image of innocence. Their silence was not neutral. It was a deliberate act of hiding. And here's the bitter irony. While they thought they were clever by staying quiet, they were actually confessing their fear by refusing to defend you. They admitted they were terrified of being exposed themselves. They revealed they couldn't withstand the same scrutiny they let you carry. Their silence said everything. I know what's happening is wrong, but if I resist it, people will see the same cracks in me that they see in you. But that choice comes with a price. Because once the spotlight shifts, as it always does, the silence they used as a shield turns into evidence against them. It proves they knew. It proves they chose safety over truth. And it proves they were only loyal to themselves. The very thing they thought would protect them ends up branding them. Your torment gave them temporary shelter, but your survival will make sure the spotlight eventually exposes them for what they are. Accomplices dressed in cowardice. Number 11. Your endurance exposed their fragility. Your endurance exposed their fragility. That's the raw truth behind their silence. You lived through storms that would have torn them apart in days. And the fact that you didn't collapse unsettled them. It wasn't just that they didn't want to help. It's that your survival highlighted how little strength they actually had. Every time you got up after being knocked down, it held up a mirror to their inability to withstand discomfort, rejection, or even minor setbacks. That quiet comparison humiliated them. When someone else's resilience shows up, it forces people to reckon with their own limits. Defending you would have meant admitting that you carried a weight they couldn't. It would have meant acknowledging that their excuses, their fears and their self-protective choices were flimsy compared to your endurance. Most people don't want that kind of confrontation. It's easier to call you reckless, stubborn, or different than to admit you're simply stronger. So instead of stepping up, they chose silence as a cover. Silence became their way of shielding their own weakness. If they ignored your struggle, they didn't have to admit they wouldn't have lasted in your shoes. If they pretended not to see your resilience, they didn't have to acknowledge how their own lives were built on comfort, shortcuts, and avoidance. You surviving wasn't just inconvenient for them. It was embarrassing. It stripped away their excuses and revealed that they weren't nearly as strong as they wanted people to believe. And here's the deeper twist. Your endurance turned their silence into a confession. They wanted to see you break, because that would have justified their cowardice. If you had collapsed, they could have said, "See, no one could survive that." But your survival stole that narrative. It proved that someone could survive it. And it exposed that they simply wouldn't. That's why their silence wasn't just fear. It was defense. They weren't protecting you. They were protecting the fragile image they had of themselves. Your endurance became living evidence. It exposed their limitations, their excuses, their lack of courage. And no matter how long they stay silent, that truth echoes because the one thing they hoped to hide, that they were weaker than you, was revealed every time you stood back up. Their fragility has no defense against your strength. Number 12. The leaders they trusted were the ones harming you. The leaders they trusted were the ones harming you. That's the bitter, uncomfortable fact that flips every comforting story people tell about authority and protection. When those at the top, the respected elders, the influential figures, the people whose names open doors are the architects or enablers of harm, speaking up against them becomes more than an act of courage. It becomes a threat to an entire structure that benefits a lot of people. Defending you would have meant challenging not just one person, but the network that props that person up. Alliances, reputations, finances, and the unspoken rules that keep everyone's common sense to so many. Power buys silence in small practical ways. People owe favors, expect promotions, want endorsements, or fear being blacklisted from opportunity. Standing against a leader risks those things, and many choose the safer route even when their moral compass points elsewhere. The result is a system where the very people who should be accountable are protected by layers of loyalty and interest. Those layers turn evidence and testimony into negotiable commodities. Instead of being used to stop harm, information is rerouted through back channels, softened or buried to preserve the leader's image. The community then learns to trust the leader, because trust is easier than confrontation, and the cycle repeats. When leadership is the source of harm, silence is weaponized as preservation. People aren't just afraid of repercussions. They are invested in the system that gives them meaning, identity, and stability. To challenge the leader is to risk being uprooted from that identity. That explains why institutions often defend their own long after reason and decency demand otherwise. Those defenses are not built on truth, but on a pile of convenient compromises and incremental betrayals that look like policies on paper. This dynamic also explains why exposing the truth is so destabilizing. It doesn't just call out a single offender. It threatens the legitimacy of an entire order. That threat, is why those in power will more often than not marshal the community, the law and the language of reputation to discredit the victim instead of accepting responsibility. Their instinct is to secure the system first, then figure out how to manage the fallout. That priority reveals what matters most to them, the maintenance of power, not the protection of people. Understanding this changes who you hold accountable and why. It shows that silence is rarely about ignorance, and more often about safeguarding an ecosystem of advantage. When leaders hurt you and the community looks away, the injury is doubled. Once by the original harm, and again by the institutional choice to preserve itself. Your courage in speaking cracks that armor, and that rupture will expose not only the abuser, but the fragile architecture that kept them safe. Number 13. Your pain threatened their carefully built illusions. Their pain threatened their carefully built illusions. People invest in stories about themselves and their world because those stories keep panic, guilt, and chaos at bay. When you were harmed, your reality didn't just present a problem. It punctured the comforting narrative they'd stitched together. That their community is safe, their family is honorable, their choices are justified. Accepting what happened to you meant admitting that the neat map they relied on was full of unmarked traps. So rather than redraw the map, they chose to erase the evidence and preserve the fiction. That preservation looks ordinary because it's ordinary. It shows up as change subjects in conversation, polite evasions, and an instinct to steer the focus away from what you lived through. People prefer explanations that keep them comfortable, accidents, misunderstandings, or blaming you outright. Those convenient stories protect their identity. They make it possible for neighbors to nod at church colleagues, to share elevator smiles, and relatives to keep inviting the same people to family dinners without ever confronting the harm. The illusion functions like social glue, and exposing the truth would mean admitting the glue was made from lies. Holding that illusion together becomes a group project. When someone threatens it, the group rallies not to discover the truth, but to defend the story that binds them. That defense can take ugly shapes, minimizing what happened to you, reinterpreting facts, or insisting the matter is over when it isn't. Silence isn't accidental here. It's a deliberate tactic. By pretending nothing is wrong, they avoid the messy work of reshaping loyalties, reassigning blame, or losing status. It's cheaper to sacrifice one person's reality than to rebuild a whole social architecture. The cost of protecting the illusion is real and lasting. You are pushed to the margin so the center can remain whole. Their daily comfort is paid for by your continued suffering, but the illusion also eats at them from the inside. It demands constant editing, selective memory, and ethical dodges. Over time, the people who defended the lie carry its weight in secret. The guilt, the small justifications, the private discomfort they never voice. Their safety becomes brittle because it depends on ignoring a truth that eventually demands to be seen. Your experience disrupts their story. And that's why they fought so hard to silence it. In protecting the illusion, they revealed what they valued most, the appearance of order over the reality of justice. That choice tells you everything about who they are when their world is threatened. Caretakers of comfort, not of truth. Number 14. Their inaction will haunt them longer than your scars. Their inaction will haunt them longer than your scars. Scars, no matter how deep, eventually harden into memory. They become part of your story, a testimony that you lived, endured, and kept going. But silence is different. The people who chose it thought they were buying themselves safety, neutrality, and distance from your pain. What they actually purchased was a debt that cannot be erased. Every time they replay the moment they could have spoken but didn't, the silence echoes louder. It becomes a mark they can't show but also can't shake. Your scars are visible proof of a battle survived. They tell the world you were tested and refused to break. Their silence, on the other hand, is a ghost that visits unannounced. It sits in their conversations, in the awkward glances, in the tightening of their chest when your name comes up. They can dodge questions, they can rewrite history, but deep down they know. When it mattered most, they folded. That truth does not go away. It doesn't heal. It lingers like a shadow, stretching further the more they try to outrun it. What makes it worse is that silence leaves no heroic narrative to lean on. You have scars that speak of strength, resilience, and survival. They have nothing but absence. No story of bravery, no defense of principle, no evidence they stood for anything. And people feel that void. They carry it like a hidden scar of their own, one they can't display with honor, but only conceal with denial. Every new situation that reminds them of you reopens that wound, reminding them of what they didn't do. Time is cruel in this regard. Your scars will one day be read as wisdom, as depth, as proof of a spirit that endured. Their silence will only grow heavier with time, transforming from a decision into a defining trait. Long after you've rebuilt, healed, and carried your lessons forward, they will still be haunted by the question, "Why didn't I speak?" That question won't fade. It won't forgive. It will gnaw at them in private. A conscience that refuses to stay buried. The irony is sharp. Your scars liberated you by teaching survival, but their silence imprisoned them in a cycle of guilt. And no matter how much they try to mask it, that haunting becomes their legacy. What all of this reveals is brutally clear. The silence of others was never about you. It was about them. It was about fear, convenience, self-preservation, and the fragile illusions they were unwilling to challenge. They calculated, they watched, they waited, and in doing so they revealed who they really were. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every moment of inaction was a confession of their priorities, not a reflection of your worth. But here's the undeniable truth. Your endurance, your resilience, and your refusal to break have already rewritten the story. While they hid behind convenience, their silence marking them for what it is. You survived, and your survival carries power, wisdom, and proof. Your scars are no longer just reminders of what was done to you. They are evidence that you transcended it. Every betrayal you endured became a tool, every quiet observer a lesson in human nature, and every attempt to diminish you only highlighted your strength. Their choices may have branded them, but your journey has branded you as unstoppable, unshakable, and uncontainable. The same people who thought your pain would stay buried will one day face the undeniable record of their complicity. Your story will speak louder than their excuses, and that truth is permanent. So hold your head high, chosen one. Know that your survival is the answer to their silence. Know that their fear, their calculation, and their cowardice only underline the magnitude of your courage. Your scars tell the story they tried to erase, and your life proves the power of standing, moving, and rising when the world turns its back. If this message hit home, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected. Like the video to show your support. Comment to share your thoughts and experiences. And share it with others who need to hear the truth. Every action amplifies the message, honors resilience, and reminds the world that those who endure are never alone. God bless you.